Part two of It Could Be Anything by Keith Laumer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Brett stood, rounded the foot of the bed, approached the two unmoving figures. The girl looked young, sleek, perfect featured, with soft dark hair. Her eyes were half open. Brett caught a glint of light reflected from the eyeball. The man was bronzed, broad shouldered, his hair wavy and blond. His lips were parted, showing even white teeth. The two stood, not breathing, sightless eyes fixed on nothing. Brett took the bouquet from the woman's hand. The flowers seemed real, except that they had no perfume. He dropped them on the floor, pulled at the male golem to clear the door. The figure pivoted, toppled, hit with a heavy thump. Brett raised the woman in his arms and propped her against the bed. Back at the door he listened. All was quiet now. He started to open the door, then hesitated. He went back to the bed, undid the tiny pearl buttons down the front of the bridal gown, pulled it open. The breasts were rounded, smooth, and unbroken creamy white. In the hall he started toward the door. A tall gel rippled into view ahead, its shape flowing and wavering, now billowing out, then rising up. The shifting form undulated towards Brett. He made a move to run, then remembered Dhuva stood motionless. The gel wobbled past him, slumped suddenly, flowed under a door. Brett let out a breath. Never mind the fat man. There were too many gels here. He started back along the corridor. Soft music came from the double doors which stood open on a landing. Brett went to them, risked a look inside. Graceful couples moved sedately on a polished floor. Diners sat at tables, black-clad waiters moving among them. At the far side of the room, near a dusty rubber plant, sat the fat man, studying a menu. As Brett watched, he shook out a napkin, ran it around inside his collar, then mopped his face. Never disturb a scene, Dhuva had said, but perhaps he could blend with it. Brett brushed at his suit, straightened his tie, stepped into the room. A waiter approached, eyed him dubiously. Brett got out his wallet, took out a $5 bill. "A quiet table in the corner," he said. He glanced back. There were no gels in sight. He followed the waiter to a table near the fat man. Seated, he looked around. He wanted to talk to the fat man, but he couldn't afford to attract attention. He could watch, and wait his chance. At the nearby tables, men with well-pressed suits, clean collars, and carefully shaved faces murmured to sleekly gowned women who fingered wine glasses, smiled archly. He caught fragments of conversation. "My dear, have you heard?" "In the low 80s." "Quite impossible. One must. For this time of year." The waiter returned with a shallow bowl of milky soup. Brett looked at the array of spoons, forks, knives, glanced sideways at the diners at the next table. It was important to follow the correct ritual. He put his napkin in his lap, careful to shake out all the folds. He looked at the spoons again, picked up a large one, glanced at the waiter. So far, so good. "Wine, sir?" Brett indicated the neighboring couple. "The same as they're having." The waiter turned away, returned holding a wine bottle, labeled toward Brett. He looked at it, nodded. The waiter busied himself with the cork, removing it with many flourishes. Setting a glass before Brett, pouring half an inch of wine. He waited expectantly. Brett picked up the glass, tasted it. It tasted like wine. He nodded. The waiter poured. Brett wondered what would have happened if he had made a face and spurned it. But it would be too risky to try. No one ever did it. Couples danced, resumed their seats. Others rose and took the floor. A string ensemble in a distant corner played restrained tunes that seemed to speak of the gentle, faded melancholy of decorous tea dances on long forgotten afternoons. Brett glanced toward the fat man. He was eating soup noisily, his napkin tied under his chin. The waiter was back with a plate. "Lovely day, sir," he said. "Great," Brett agreed. The waiter placed a covered platter on the table, removed the cover, stood with carving knife and fork poised. "A bit of the crispy, sir?" Brett nodded. He eyed the waiter surreptitiously. He looked real. Some golems seemed realer than others. Or perhaps it merely depended on the parts they were playing. The man who had fallen at the parade had been only a sort of extra, a crowd member. The waiter, on the other hand, was able to converse. Perhaps it would be possible to learn something from him. "What's how do you spell the name of this town?" Brett asked. "I was never much of a one for spelling, sir," the waiter said. "Try it." "Gravy, sir?" "Sure. Try to spell the name." "Perhaps I'd better call the head waiter, sir," the golem said stiffly. From the corner of an eye, Brett caught a flicker of motion. He whirled, saw nothing. Had it been a gel? "Never mind," he said. The waiter served potatoes, peas, refilled the wine glass, moved off silently. The question had been a little too unorthodox, Brett decided. Perhaps if he led up to the subject more obliquely. When the waiter returned, Brett said, "Nice day." "Very nice, sir." "Better than yesterday." "Yes, indeed, sir." "I wonder what tomorrow'll be like." "Perhaps we'll have a bit of rain, sir." Brett nodded toward the dance floor. "Nice orchestra." "They're very popular, sir." "From here in town?" "I wouldn't know as to that, sir." "Lived here long yourself?" "Oh, yes, sir." The waiter's expression showed disapproval. "Would there be anything else, sir?" "I'm a newcomer here," Brett said. "I wonder if you could tell me " "Excuse me, sir." The waiter was gone. Brett poked at the mashed potatoes. Quizzing golems was hopeless. He would have to find out for himself. He turned to look at the fat man. As Brett watched, he took a large handkerchief from a pocket, blew his nose loudly. No one turned to look. The orchestra played softly. The couples danced. Now was as good a time as any. Brett rose, crossed to the other's table. The man looked up. "Mind if I sit down?" Brett said. "I'd like to talk to you." The fat man blinked, motioned to a chair. Brett sat down, leaned across the table. "Maybe I'm wrong," he said quietly, "but I think you're real." The fat man blinked again. "What's that?" he snapped. He had a high, petulant voice. "You're not like the rest of them. I think I can talk to you. I think you're another outsider." The fat man looked down at his rumpled suit. I was caught a little short today. Didn't have time to change. I'm a busy man. And what business is it of yours?" He clamped his jaws shut, eyed Brett warily. "I'm a stranger here," Brett said. "I want to find out what's going on in this place." "Buy an amusement guide. Lists all the shows." "I didn't mean that. I mean these dummies all over the place. And the gels." "What dummies? Gels? Jello? You don't like Jello." "I love Jello. I don't " "Just ask the waiter. He'll bring you your Jello. Any flavor you like. Now, if you'll excuse me " "I'm talking about the brown things. They look like muddy water. They come around if you interfere with the scene." The fat man looked nervous. "Please go away." "If I make a disturbance, the gels will come. Is that what you're afraid of?" Now, be calm. No need for you to get excited." "I won't make a scene," Brett said. "Just talk to me. How long have you been here?" "I dislike scenes. I dislike them intensely." "When did you come here?" "Just 10 minutes ago. I just sat down. I haven't had my dinner yet. Please, young man, go back to your table." The fat man watched Brett warily. Sweat glistened on his bald head. "I mean this town. How long have you been here? Where did you come from?" "Why, I was born here. Where did I come from? What sort of question is that? Just consider that the stork brought me." "You were born here?" "Certainly." "What's the name of the town?" "Are you trying to make a fool of me?" The fat man was getting angry. His voice was rising. "Shh," Brett cautioned. "You'll attract the gels." "Blast the jilts, whatever that is," the fat man snapped. "Now get along with you. I'll call the manager." "Don't you know?" Brett said, staring at the fat man. "They're all dummies. Golems, they're called. They're not real." "Who are not real?" "All these imitation people at the tables and on the dance floor. Surely you realize." "I realize you're in need of medical attention." The fat man pushed back his chair and got to his feet. "You keep the table," he said. "I'll dine elsewhere." "Wait." Brett got up, seized the fat man's arm. "Take your hands off me." The fat man went toward the door. Brett followed. At the cashier's desk, Brett turned suddenly, saw a fluid brown shape flicker. "Look!" He pulled at the fat man's arm. "Look at what?" The gel was gone. It was there! A gel! The fat man flung down a bill, hurried away. Brett fumbled out a 10, waited for change. "Wait!" he called. He heard the fat man's feet receding down the stairs. "Hurry," he said to the cashier. The woman sat glassy eyed, staring at nothing. The music died. The lights flickered, went off. In the gloom, Brett saw a fluid shape rise up. He ran, pounding down the stairs. The fat man was just rounding the corner. Brett opened his mouth to call, and went rigid, as a translucent shape of mud shot from the door, rose up to tower before him. Brett stood, mouth half open, eyes staring, leaning forward with hands outflung. The gel loomed, its surface flickering, waiting. Brett caught an acrid odor of geraniums. A minute passed. Brett's cheek itched. He fought a desire to blink, to swallow, to turn and run. The high sun beat down on the silent street, the still window displays. Then the gel broke form, slumped, flashed away. Brett tottered back against the wall, let his breath out in a harsh sigh. Across the street he saw a window with a display of camping equipment, portable stoves, boots, rifles. He crossed the street, tried the door. It was locked. He looked up and down the street. There was no one in sight. He kicked in the glass beside the latch, reached through and turned the knob. Inside, he looked over the shelves, selected a heavy coil of nylon rope, a sheath knife, a canteen. He examined a Winchester repeating rifle with a telescopic sight, then put it back and strapped on a .22 revolver. He emptied 2 boxes of long rifle cartridges into his pocket, then loaded the pistol. He coiled the rope over his shoulder and went back out into the empty street. The fat man was standing in front of a shop in the next block, picking at a blemish on his chin, and eyeing the window display. He looked up with a frown, started away as Brett came up. "Wait a minute," Brett called. "Didn't you see the gel? The one that cornered me back there?" The fat man looked up suspiciously, kept going. "Wait." Brett caught his arm. "I know you're real. I've seen you belch and sweat and scratch. You're the only one I can call on, and I need help. My friend is trapped." The fat man pulled away, his face flushed an even deeper red. "I'm warning you, you maniac. Get away from me." Brett stepped close, rammed the fat man hard in the ribs. He sank to his knees, gasping. The Panama hat rolled away. Brett grabbed his arm, steadied him. "Sorry," he said. "I had to be sure. You're real, all right. We've got to rescue my friend, Dhuva." The fat man leaned against the glass, rolling terrified eyes, rubbing his stomach. "I'll call the police," he gasped. "What police?" Brett waved an arm. "Look, not a car in sight. Did you ever see the street that empty before?" "Wednesday afternoon," the fat man gasped. "Come with me. I want to show you. It's all hollow. There's nothing behind these walls." "Why doesn't somebody come along?" the fat man moaned. "The masonry is only a ¼ inch thick," Brett said. "Come on, I'll show you." "I don't like it," said the fat man. His face was pale and moist. "You're mad. What's wrong? It's so quiet." "We've got to try to save him. The gel took him down into this pit." "Let me go," the man whined. "I'm afraid. Can't you just let me lead my life in peace?" "Don't you understand? The gel took a man. They may be after you next." "There's no one after me. I'm a businessman, a respectable citizen. I mind my own business, give to charity, go to church. All I want is to be left alone." Brett dropped his hands from the fat man's arms, stood looking at him. The blotched face, pale now, the damp forehead, the quivering jowls. The fat man stooped for his hat, slapped it against his leg, clapped it on his head. "I think I understand now," said Brett. "This is your place, this imitation city. Everything's faked to fit your needs, like in the hotel. Wherever you go, the scene unrolls in front of you. You never see the gels, never discover the secret of the golems, because you conform. You never do the unexpected." "That's right. I'm law abiding. I'm respectable. I don't pry. I don't nose into other people's business. Why should I? Just let me alone." "Sure," Brett said. "Even if I dragged you down there and showed you, you wouldn't believe it. But you're not in the scene now. I've taken you out of it." Suddenly the fat man turned and ran a few yards, then looked back to see whether Brett was pursuing him. He shook a round fist. "I've seen your kind before," he shouted. "Troublemakers." Brett took a step toward him. The fat man yelped and ran another 50 feet, his coat tails bobbing. He looked back, stopped, a fat figure alone in the empty, sunny street. "You haven't seen the last of me," he shouted. "We know how to deal with your kind." He tugged at his vest, went off along the sidewalk. Brett watched him go, then started back toward the hollow building. The jagged fragments of masonry Brett had knocked from the wall lay as he had left them. He stepped through the opening, peered down into the murky pit, trying to judge its depth. 100 feet at least, perhaps 150. He unslung the rope from his shoulder, tied one end to the brass stump, threw the coil down the precipitous side. It fell away into darkness, hung swaying. It was impossible to tell whether the end reached any solid footing below. He couldn't waste any more time looking for help. He would have to try it alone. There was a scrape of shoe leather on the pavement outside. He turned, stepped out into the white sunlight. The fat man rounded the corner, recoiled as he saw Brett. He flung out a pudgy forefinger, his protruding eyes wide in his blotchy red face. "There he is! I told you he came this way." Two uniformed policemen came into view. One eyed the gun at Brett's side, put a hand on his own. "Better take that off, sir." "Look," Brett said to the fat man. He stooped, picked up a crust of masonry. "Look at this. Just a shell." "He's blasted a hole right in that building, officer," the fat man shrilled. "He's dangerous." The cop ignored the gaping hole in the wall. "You'll have to come along with me, sir. This gentleman registered a complaint." Brett stood staring into the cop's eyes. They were pale blue eyes, looking steadily back at him from a bland face. Could the cop be real? Or would he be able to push him over, as he had other golems? "The fellow's not right in the head," the fat man was saying to the cop. "You should have heard his crazy talk. A troublemaker. His kind have got to be locked up." The cop nodded. "Can't have anyone causing trouble." "Only a young fellow," said the fat man. He mopped at his forehead with a large handkerchief. "Tragic. But I'm sure that you men know how to handle him." "Better give me the gun, sir." The cop held out a hand. Brett moved suddenly, rammed stiff fingers into the cop's ribs. He stiffened, toppled, lay rigid, staring up at nothing. "You killed him," the fat man gasped, backing. The second cop tugged at his gun. Brett leaped at him, sent him down with a blow to the ribs. He turned to face the fat man. "I didn't kill them. I just turned them off. They're not real. They're just golems." "A killer! And right in the city, in broad daylight." "You've got to help me," Brett cried. "This whole scene, don't you see? It has the air of something improvised in a hurry, to deal with the unexpected factor. That's me. The gels know something's wrong, but they can't quite figure out what. When you called the cops, the gels obliged." Startlingly, the fat man burst into tears. He fell to his knees. "Don't kill me! Oh, don't kill me!" "Nobody's going to kill you, you fool," Brett snapped. "Look, I want to show you." He seized the fat man's lapel, dragged him to his feet and across the sidewalk. Through the opening, the fat man stopped dead, stumbled back. "What's this? What kind of place is this?" He scrambled for the opening. "It's what I've been trying to tell you. This city you live in, it's a hollow shell. There's nothing inside. None of it's real. Only you and me. There was another man, Dhuva. I was in a cafe with him. A gel came. He tried to run. It caught him. Now he's down there." "I'm not alone," the fat man babbled. "I have my friends, my clubs, my business associates. I'm insured. Lately I've been thinking a lot about Jesus." He broke off, whirled, and jumped for the doorway. Brett leaped after him, caught his coat. It ripped. The fat man stumbled over one of the cop golems, went to his hands and knees. Brett stood over him. "Get up, damn it," he snapped. "I need help and you're going to help me." He hauled the fat man to his feet. "All you have to do is stand by the rope. Dhuva may be unconscious when I find him. You'll have to help me haul him up. If anybody comes along, any gels, I mean, give me a signal. A whistle, like this." Brett demonstrated. "And if I get in trouble, do what you can. Here." Brett started to offer the fat man the gun, then handed him the hunting knife. "If anybody interferes, this may not do any good, but it's something. I'm going down, now." The fat man watched as Brett gripped the rope, let himself over the edge. Brett looked up at the glistening face, the damp strands of hair across the freckled scalp. Brett had no assurance that the man would stay at his post, but he had done what he could. "Remember," said Brett, "it's a real man they've got. Like you and me. Not a golem. We owe it to him." The fat man's hands trembled. He watched Brett, licked his lips. Brett started down. The descent was easy. The rough base of the excavation gave footholds. The end of a decaying timber projected. Below it was the stump of a crumbling concrete pipe 2 feet in diameter. Brett was 10 feet below the rim of the floor now. Above, the broad figure of the fat man was visible in silhouette against the jagged opening in the wall. Now the cliff shelved back. The rope hung free. Brett eased past the cut end of the rusted water pipe, went down hand over hand. If there were nothing at the bottom to give him footing, it would be a long climb back. 20 feet below he could see the still black water, pockmarked with expanding rings where bits of debris dislodged by his passage peppered the surface. There was a rhythmic vibration in the rope. Brett felt it through his hands, a fine, sawing sensation. He was falling, gripping the limp rope. He slammed on his back in 3 feet of oily water. The coils of rope collapsed around him with a sustained splashing. He got to his feet, groped for the end of the rope. The glossy nylon strands had been cleanly cut. For half an hour Brett waded in waist deep water along a wall of damp clay that rose sheer above him. Far above, bars of dim sunlight crossed the upper reaches of the cavern. He had seen no signs of Dhuva or the gels. He encountered a sodden timber that projected above the surface of the pool, clung to it to rest. Bits of flotsam, a plastic pistol, bridge tallies, a golf bag, floated in the black water. A tunnel extended through the clay wall ahead. Beyond, Brett could see a second great cavern rising. He pictured the city, silent and empty above, and the honeycombed earth beneath. He moved on. An hour later Brett had traversed the second cavern. Now he clung to an outthrust spur of granite directly beneath the point at which the Duva had disappeared. Far above he could see the green clad waitress standing stiffly on her ledge. He was tired. Walking in water, his feet floundering in soft mud, was exhausting. He was no closer to escape, or to finding Duva, than he had been when the fat man cut the rope. He had been a fool to leave the man alone, with a knife, but he had had no choice. He would have to find another way out. Endlessly waiting at the bottom of the pit was useless. He would have to climb. One spot was as good as another. He stepped back and scanned the wall of clay looming over him. 20 feet up, water dripped from the broken end of a 4-inch water main. Brett uncoiled the rope from his shoulder, tied a loop in the end, whirled it, then cast upward. It missed, fell back with a splash. He gathered it in, tried again. On the third try it caught. He tested it, then started up. His hands were slippery with mud and water. He twined the rope around his legs, inched higher. The slender cable was smooth as glass. He slipped back 2 feet, then inched upward, slipped again, painfully climbed, slipped, climbed. After the first 10 feet, he found toe holds in the muddy wall. He worked his way up, his hands aching and raw. A projecting tangle of power cable gave a secure purchase for a foot. He rested. Nearby, an opening 2 feet in diameter gaped in the clay. A tunnel. It might be possible to swing sideways across the face of the clay and reach the opening. It was worth a try. His stiff, clay slimed hands would pull him no higher. He gripped the rope, kicked off sideways, hooked a foot in the tunnel mouth, half jumped, half fell into the mouth of the tunnel. He clung to the rope, shook it loose from the pipe above, coiled it and looped it over his shoulder. On hands and knees, he started into the narrow passage. The tunnel curved left, then right, dipped, then angled up. Brett crawled steadily, the smooth, stiff clay yielding and cold against his hands and sodden knees. Another smaller tunnel joined from the left. Another angled in from above. The tunnel widened to 3 feet, then 4. Brett got to his feet, walked in a crouch. Here and there, barely visible in the near darkness, objects lay embedded in the mud. A silver plated spoon, its handle bent. The rusted engine of an electric train. A portable radio, green with corrosion from burst batteries. At a distance, Brett estimated, of 100 yards from the pit, the tunnel opened into a vast cave, green lit from tiny discs of frosted glass set in the ceiling far above. A row of discolored concrete piles, the foundations of the building above, protruded against the near wall, their surfaces nibbled and pitted. Between Brett and the concrete columns the floor was littered with pale sticks and stones, gleaming dully in the gloom. Brett started to cross the floor. One of the sticks snapped underfoot. He kicked a melon-sized stone. It rolled lightly, came to rest with hollow eyes staring toward him. A human skull. The floor of the cave covered an area the size of a city block. It was blanketed with human bones, with here and there a small cat skeleton or the fanged snout bones of a dog. There was a constant rustling of rats that played among the rib cages, sat atop crania, scuttled behind shin bones. Brett picked his way, stepping over imitation pearl necklaces, zircon rings, plastic buttons, hearing aids, lipsticks, compacts, corset stays, prosthetic devices, rubber heels, wrist watches, lapel watches, pocket watches with corroded brass chains. Ahead, Brett saw a patch of color, a blur of pale yellow. He hurried, stumbling over bone heaps, crunching eyeglasses underfoot. He reached the still figure where it lay slackly, face down. Gingerly he squatted, turned it on its back. It was Dhuva. Brett slapped the cold wrists, rubbed the clammy hands. Dhuva stirred, moaned weakly. Brett pulled him to a sitting position. "Wake up!" he whispered. "Wake up." Dhuva's eyelids fluttered. He blinked dully at Brett. "The Gels may turn up at any minute," Brett hissed. "We have to get away from here. Can you walk?" "I saw it," said Dhuva faintly. "But it moves so fast." "You're safe here for the moment," Brett said. "There are none of them around. But they may be back. We've got to find a way out." Dhuva started up, staring around. "Where am I?" he said hoarsely. Brett seized his arm, steadied him on his feet. "We're in a hollowed out cave," he said. "The whole city is undermined with them. They're connected by tunnels. We have to find one leading back to the surface." Dhuva gazed around at the acres of bones. "It left me here for dead." "Or to die," said Brett. "Look at them," Dhuva breathed. "Hundreds. Thousands. The whole population, it looks like. The Gels must have whisked them down here one by one." "But why?" "For interfering with the scenes. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is getting out. Come on. I see tunnels on the other side." They crossed the broad floor. Around them the white bones, the rustle of rats. They reached the far side of the cave, picked a 6-foot tunnel which trended upward, a trickle of water seeping out of the dark mouth. They started up the slope. "We have to get a weapon against the Gels," said Brett. "Why? I don't want to fight them." Dhuva's voice was thin, frightened. "I want to get away from here. Even back to Wavely. I'd rather face the Duke." "This was a real town once," said Brett. "The Gels have taken it over, hollowed out the buildings, mined the earth under it, killed off the people, and put imitation people in their place. And nobody ever knew. I met a man who's lived here all his life. He doesn't know. But we know, and we've got to do something about it." "It's not our business. I've had enough. I want to get away." "The Gels must stay down below, somewhere in that maze of tunnels. For some reason they try to keep up appearances, but only for the people who belong here. They play out scenes for the fat man, wherever he goes. And he never goes anywhere he isn't expected to." "We'll get over the wall somehow," said Dhuva. "We may starve, crossing the dry fields, but that's better than this." They emerged from the tunnel into a coal bin, crossed to a sagging door, found themselves in a boiler room. Stairs led up to sunlight. In the street, in the shadow of tall buildings, a boxy sedan was parked at the curb. Brett went to it, tried the door. It opened. Keys dangled from the ignition switch. He slid into the dusty seat. Behind him there was a hoarse scream. Brett looked up. Through the streaked windshield he saw a mighty Gel rear up before Dhuva, who crouched back against the blackened brick front of the building. "Don't move, Dhuva!" Brett shouted. Dhuva stood frozen, flattened against the wall. The Gel towered, its surface rippling. Brett eased from the seat. He stood on the pavement, 15 feet from the Gel. The rank Gel odor came in waves from the creature. Beyond it, he could see Dhuva's white, terrified face. Silently, Brett turned the latch of the old fashioned auto hood, raised it. The copper fuel line curved down from the firewall to a glass sediment cup. The knurled retaining screw turned easily. The cup dropped into Brett's hand. Gasoline ran down in an amber stream. Brett pulled off his damp coat, wadded it, jammed it under the flow. Over his shoulder he saw Dhuva, still rigid, and the Gel hovering, uncertain. The coat was saturated with gasoline now. Brett fumbled a matchbox from his pocket. Wet. He threw the sodden container aside. The battery caught his eye, clamped in a rusted frame under the hood. He jerked the pistol from his holster, used it to short the terminals. Tiny blue sparks jumped. He jammed the coat nearer, rasped the gun against the soft lead poles. With a whoosh, the coat caught. Yellow flames leapt, soot rimmed. Brett snatched at a sleeve, whirled the coat high. The great Gel, attracted by the sudden motion, rushed at him. He flung the blazing garment over the monster, leaped aside. The creature went mad. It slumped, lashed itself against the pavement. The burning coat was thrown clear. The gel threw itself across the pavement into the gutter, sending a splatter of filthy water over Brett. From the corner of his eye, Brett saw Dhuva seize the burning coat, hurl it into the pool of gasoline in the gutter. Fire leapt 20 feet high. In its center, the great gel bucked and writhed. The ancient car shuddered as the frantic monster struck it. Black smoke boiled up. An unbelievable stench came to Brett's nostrils. He backed, coughing. Flames roared around the front of the car. Paint blistered and burned. A tire burst. In a final frenzy, the gel whipped clear, lay, a great blackened shape of melting rubber, twitching, then still. "They've tunneled under everything," Brett said. "They've cut through power lines and water lines. Concrete, steel, earth. They've left the shell, shored up with spidery looking trusswork. Somehow, they've kept water and power flowing to wherever they needed it." "I don't care about your theories," Dhuva said. "I only want to get away." "It's bound to work, Dhuva. I need your help." "No." "Then I'll have to try alone." He turned away. "Wait," Dhuva called. He came up to Brett. "I owe you a life. You saved mine. I can't let you down now. But if this doesn't work, or if you can't find what you want, then we'll go." Together they turned down a side street, walking rapidly. At the next corner, Brett pointed. "There's one." They crossed to the service station at a run. Brett tried the door. Locked. He kicked at it, splintered the wood around the lock. He glanced around inside. "No good," he called. "Try the next building. I'll check the one behind." He crossed the wide drive, battered in a door, looked in at a floor covered with wood shavings. It ended 10 feet from the door. Brett went to the edge, looked down. Diagonally, 40 feet away, the underground 50,000-gallon storage tank which supplied the gasoline pumps of the station perched, isolated, on a column of striated clay, ribbed with chitinous gel buttresses. The truncated feed lines ended 6 feet from the tank. From Brett's position, it was impossible to say whether the ends were plugged. Across the dark cavern, a square of light appeared. Dhuva stood in a doorway looking toward Brett. "Over here, Dhuva." Brett uncoiled his rope, arranged a slip noose. He measured the distance with his eye, tossed the loop. It slapped the top of the tank, caught on a massive fitting. He smashed the glass from a window, tied the end of the rope to the center post. Dhuva arrived, watched as Brett went to the edge, hooked his legs over the rope, and started across to the tank. It was an easy crossing. Brett's feet clanged against the tank. He straddled the 6-foot cylinder, worked his way to the end, then clambered down to the two 2-inch feed lines. He tested their resilience, then lay flat, eased out on them. There were plugs of hard, waxy material in the cut ends of the pipes. Brett poked at them with the pistol. Chunks loosened and fell. He worked for 15 minutes before the first trickle came. 2 minutes later, 2 thick streams of gasoline were pouring down into the darkness. Brett and Dhuva piled sticks, scraps of paper, shavings, and lumps of coal around a core of gasoline-soaked rags. Directly above the heaped tinder, a taut rope stretched from the window post to a child's wagon, the steel bed of which contained a second heap of combustibles. The wagon hung half over the ragged edge of the floor. "It should take about 15 minutes for the fire to burn through the rope," Brett said. "Then the wagon will fall and dump the hot coals in the gasoline. By then it will have spread all over the surface and flowed down side tunnels into other parts of the cavern system. But it may not get them all." "It will get some of them. It's the best we can do right now. You get the fire going in the wagon. I'll start this one up." Dhuva sniffed the air. "That's fluid," he said. "We know it in Waveley as Phlogistonium. The wealthy use it for cooking. We'll use it to cook gels. Brett struck a match. The fire leapt up, smoking. Dhuva watched, struck his match awkwardly, started his blaze. They stood for a moment watching. The nylon curled and blackened, melting in the heat. "We'd better get moving," Brett said. "It doesn't look as though it will last 15 minutes." They stepped out into the street. Behind them, wisps of smoke curled from the door. Dhuva seized Brett's arm. "Look." Half a block away the fat man in the Panama hat strode toward them at the head of a group of men in gray flannel. "That's him," the fat man shouted. "The one I told you about. I knew the scoundrel would be back." He slowed, eyeing Brett and Dhuva warily. "You'd better get away from here, fast," Brett called. "There'll be an explosion in a few minutes." "Smoke!" the fat man yelped. "Fire! They've set fire to the city. There it is, pouring out of the window and the door." He started forward. Brett yanked the pistol from the holster, thumbed back the hammer. "Stop right there," he barked. "For your own good, I'm telling you to run. I don't care about that crowd of golems you've collected, but I'd hate to see a real human get hurt. Even a cowardly one like you." "These are honest citizens," the fat man gasped, standing, staring at the gun. "You won't get away with this. We all know you. You'll be dealt with." "We're going now, and you're going too." "You can't kill us all," the fat man said. He licked his lips. "We won't let you destroy our city." As the fat man turned to exhort his followers, Brett fired. Once, twice, 3 times. 3 golems fell on their faces. The fat man whirled. "Devil!" he shrieked. "A killer is abroad!" He charged, mouth open. Brett ducked aside, tripped the fat man. He fell heavily, slamming his face against the pavement. The golems surged forward. Brett and Dhuva slammed punches to the sternum, took clumsy blows on the shoulder, back, chest. Golems fell. Brett ducked a wild swing, toppled his attacker, turned to see Dhuva deal with the last of the dummies. The fat man sat in the street, dabbing at his bleeding nose, the Panama still in place. "Get up," Brett commanded. "There's no time left." "You've killed them! Killed them all!" The fat man got to his feet, then turned suddenly and plunged for the door from which a cloud of smoke poured. Brett hauled him back. He and Dhuva started off, dragging the struggling man between them. They had gone a block when their prisoner, with a sudden, frantic jerk, freed himself, set off at a run for the fire. "Let him go," Dhuva cried. "It's too late to go back." The fat man leapt fallen golems, wrestled with the door, disappeared into the smoke. Brett and Dhuva sprinted for the corner. As they rounded it a tremendous blast shook the street. The pavement before them quivered, opened in a wide crack. A 10-foot section dropped from view. They skirted the gaping hole, dashed for safety as the facades along the street cracked and fell in clouds of dust. The street trembled under a second explosion. Cracks opened, dust rising in puffs from the long, wavering lines. Masonry collapsed around them. They put their heads down and ran. Winded, Brett and Dhuva walked through the empty streets of the city. Behind them, smoke blackened the sky. Embers floated down around them. The odor of burning gel was carried on the wind. The late sun shone on the blank pavement. A lone golem in a tasseled fez, left over from the morning's parade, leaned stiffly against a lamppost, eyes blank. Empty cars sat in driveways. TV antennae stood forlornly against the sunset. "That place looks lived in," said Brett, indicating an open apartment window with a curtain billowing above a potted geranium. "I'll take a look." He came back shaking his head. "They were all in the TV room. They looked so natural at first. I mean, they didn't look up or anything when I walked in. I turned the set off. The electricity is still working anyway. Wonder how long it will last." They turned down a residential street. Underfoot the pavement trembled at a distant blast. They skirted a crack, kept going. Occasional golems stood in awkward poses or lay across sidewalks. One, clad in black, tilted awkwardly in a Gothic entry of fretted stonework. "I guess there won't be any church this Sunday," said Brett. He halted before a brown brick apartment house. An untended hose welled on a patch of sickly lawn. Brett went to the door, stood listening, then went in. Across the room the still figure of a woman sat in a rocker. A curl stirred on her smooth forehead. A flicker of expression seemed to cross the lined face. Brett started forward. "Don't be afraid. You can come with us." He stopped. A flapping window shade cast restless shadows on the still golem features on which dust was already settling. Brett turned away, shaking his head. "All of them," he said. "It's as though they were snipped out of paper. When the gels died, their dummies died with them." "Why?" said Dhuva. "What does it all mean?" "Mean?" said Brett. He shook his head, and started off again along the street. "It doesn't mean anything. It's just the way things are." Brett sat in a deserted Cadillac, tuning the radio. "Anybody hear me?" said a plaintive voice from the speaker. "This is Abgalurian at the Twin Spires. Looks like I'm the only one left alive. Can anybody hear me?" Brett tuned. Been asking the wrong questions, looking for the final fact. Now these are strange matters, brothers, but if a flower blooms, what man shall ask why? What lore do we seek in a symphony? He twisted the knob again. "Kansas City. Not more than half a dozen of us, and the dead, piled all over the place. But it's a funny thing. Doc Potter started to do an autopsy." Brett turned the knob. "CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Hollip Quate calling. CQ, CQ. There's been a disaster here at Port Wanderlust. We need—" "Take Jesus into your hearts," another station urged. "To base," the radio said faintly, with much crackling. "Lunar Observatory to base. Come in, Lunar Control. This is Commander McVeigh of the Lunar Detachment, sole survivor. Hello? Hollip Quate? Hollip Quate? This is Kansas City calling. Say, where did you say you were calling from?" "It looks as though both of us had a lot of mistaken ideas about the world outside," said Brett. "Most of these stations sound as though they might as well be coming from Mars." "I don't understand where the voices come from," Dhuva said, "but all the places they name are strange to me, except the Twin Spires." "I've heard of Kansas City," Brett said, "but none of the other ones." The ground trembled. A low rumble rolled. "Another one," Brett said. He switched off the radio, tried the starter. It groaned, turned over. The engine caught, sputtered, then ran smoothly. "Get in, Dhuva. We might as well ride. Which way do we go to get out of this place?" "The wall lies in that direction," said Dhuva, "but I don't know about a gate." "We'll worry about that when we get to it," said Brett. "This whole place is going to collapse before long. We've really started something. I suppose other underground storage tanks caught, and gas lines too." A building ahead cracked, fell in a heap of pulverized plaster. The car bucked as a blast sent a ripple down the street. A manhole cover popped up, clattered a few feet, dropped from sight. Brett swerved, gunned the car. It leaped over rubble, roared along the littered pavement. Brett looked in the rearview mirror. A block behind them the street ended. Smoke and dust rose from the immense pit. "We've just missed it that time," he called. "How far to the wall?" "Not far. Turn here." Brett rounded the corner with a shrieking of tires. Ahead the gray wall rose up, blank, featureless. "This is a dead end," Brett shouted. "We'd better get out and run for it." "No time. I'm going to ram the wall. Maybe I can knock a hole in it." Dhuva crouched, teeth gritted. Brett held the accelerator to the floor, roared straight toward the wall. The heavy car shot across the last few yards, struck. and burst through a curtain of canvas into a field of dry stalks. Brett steered the car in a wide curve to halt and look back. A blackened Panama hat floated down, settled among the stalks. Smoke poured up in a dense cloud from behind the canvas wall. A fetid stench pervaded the air. "That finishes that, I guess," Brett said. "I don't know. Look there." Brett turned. Far across the dry field, columns of smoke rose from the ground. "The whole thing's undermined," Brett said. "How far does it go?" "No telling, but we'd better be off. Perhaps we can get beyond the edge of it. Not that it matters. We're all that's left." "You sound like the fat man," Brett said. "But why should we be so surprised to find out the truth? After all, we never saw it before. All we knew, or thought we knew, was what they told us. The moon, the other side of the world, a distant city, or even the next town. How do we really know what's there, unless we go and see for ourselves? Does a goldfish in his bowl know what the ocean is like? Where did they come from, those gels? How much of the world have they undermined? What about Waveley? Is it a golem country too? The Duke, and all the people I knew?" "I don't know, Dhuva. I've been wondering about the people in Casperton. Like Doc Welch. I used to see him in the street with his little black bag. I always thought he was full of pills and scalpels, but maybe it really had zebras' tails and toads' eyes in it. Maybe he's really a magician on his way to cast spells against demons. Maybe the people I used to see hurrying to catch the bus every morning weren't really going to the office. Maybe they go down into caves and chip away at the foundations of things. Maybe they go up on rooftops and put on rainbow colored robes and fly away. I used to pass by a bank in Casperton, a big gray stone building with little curtains over the bottom half of the windows. I never go in there. I don't have anything to do in that bank. I've always thought it was full of bankers, banking. Now I don't know. It could be anything." "That's why I'm afraid," Dhuva said. "It could be anything." "Things aren't really any different than they were," said Brett, "except that now we know." He turned the big car out across the field toward Casperton. "I don't know what we'll find when we get back, Aunt Haicey, Pretty Lee, but there's only one way to find out." The moon rose as the car bumped westward, raising a trail of dust against the luminous sky of evening. End of Part Two of It Could Be Anything by Keith Laumer.